War doesn't just break buildings, it breaks souls. In every act of military aggression, there is visible damage, craters in the ground, buildings reduced to dust, smoke rising like morning into the sky. But what we too often overlook is what war does to the unseen parts of humanity, the emotional core, the inner lives of people who will never make the headlines. When a missile strikes, it doesn't only destroy concrete and steel. It splinters identity, hope, and belonging. A child who once dreamed of becoming a doctor now trembles at every sound. A father who worked tirelessly to build a life finds himself digging through rubble for the remains of it. The true cost of violence is internalized in the people who survive it. The survivors are often called lucky, but luck is a hollow term when your memories are haunted by sirens and the sound of a loved one's last breath. What we don't see on the news are the quiet, everyday traumas. The mother who flinches at fireworks, thinking it's another airstrike. The grandmother who refuses to sleep indoors because she no longer trusts walls to protect her. The teenager who no longer believes in the future, because every dream now feels like a dangerous luxury. War steals the rhythm of daily life. It makes the ordinary walking to school, buying bread, laughing with neighbors feel like an act of defiance or a distant memory. The emotional geography of a place shifts. Homes become shelters, windows become risks, and silence becomes suspicious. People begin to move differently, speak differently, trust less, fear more. And then there's the weight of watching the world move on, as if your suffering is a segment in someone else's news cycle. That global indifference adds another layer of trauma, making people feel unseen, unheard, and dispensable. Emotional injuries aren't always loud. Sometimes they settle deep in the soul like slow poison, crippling belief systems, rewriting relationships, reprogramming what it means to be safe. So while leaders debate strategy and nations justify actions, the people endure the psychological shrapnel that lingers long after the bombs stop falling. War does not end when the last explosion fades. It lives on in the nervous systems of those who wake up screaming, in the eyes of those who have seen too much, and in the silence of those who have lost the words to say how much they've lost. Every nation has the right to defend itself, but there is a profound difference between defense and destruction. Defense is born of necessity, a response to a clear and present danger. It is a shield raised to protect what is sacred, life, liberty, family, sovereignty. But when defense becomes an excuse for domination, or when protection crosses the line into preemption, then we are no longer standing on the high ground of morality. We are sliding down into the valley of vengeance. Throughout history, we've seen how quickly the language of defense can be manipulated. One side strikes and calls it justice. The other retaliates and calls it survival. But in the space between these narratives lies a deeper truth. When the scale tips too far, when the force used outweighs the threat posed, it becomes harder to call it protection and easier to see it as provocation. True defense measures intent and restraint equally. It asks not just, can we act, but should we act this way, at this scale, with this consequence? A country must safeguard its people. That is a duty. But the method of that safeguarding must be judged not only by its military success, but by the moral ground it holds afterward. Bombs may silence threats, but they also ignite generations of grief. Missiles may eliminate targets, but they also awaken traumas that don't die easily. The ripple effect of excessive force is rarely contained within the battlefield. It seeps into neighboring hearts, minds, and histories. We have come to glorify the idea of power as explosion, loud, immediate, unforgiving. But real power, lasting power, the kind that endures beyond the battle, is measured in wisdom, in diplomacy, in restraint. To hold back when provoked is not weakness, it is the ultimate show of strength. It is a signal to the world and to one's own citizens that survival is not the same as supremacy. It's a reminder that nations are not only judged by what they protect, but by how they protect it. The instinct to strike back is human, but the choice to rise above it is divine. When a country elevates defense to the point where it leaves no room for negotiation, for humanity, or for mercy, then it trades safety for suffering and security for the illusion of control. In these moments, what's needed most is not firepower, but foresight, the ability to see that every act of destruction plants a seed, and what grows from that seed is not peace, but pain. The people are not their governments. It's a truth we forget far too easily in times of conflict, when outrage swells and headlines blur humanity into factions. We are so quick to generalize, to project the decisions of leaders onto the faces of civilians, as if the soul of a nation is a single monolithic voice. But it never has been. Nations are not defined by the iron will of those in power, but by the everyday lives of the people who rise each morning not to launch attacks, but to make breakfast, go to work, tend to children, survive another uncertain day. When we hear of a missile strike or a political standoff, it becomes tempting to see an entire population as complicit, as if millions of people sit in unison behind a desk of war. But the reality is far more intimate and complicated. The woman weaving rugs in a small village, the teenager studying under candlelight during blackouts, the baker opening his shop before sunrise. None of these people are writing foreign policy. None of them asked for war. They are simply trying to live in the space left behind by decisions they had no power to stop. Governments are shaped by agendas, alliances, strategies, and pride. People are shaped by survival, community, memory, and hope. The two are not the same. The father walking his daughter past a blow. Building does not feel represented by the sound of bombs. The child drawing peace signs in the dust does not feel loyalty to escalation. And when a country is struck, it is often not the leaders who bleed first. It is the citizens, the innocent, the overlooked. Blaming an entire people for the actions of a few is not only unjust, it is dangerous. It strips individuals of their humanity and replaces it with caricatures. It makes empathy inconvenient. It allows us to close our hearts because we have closed our minds. When we fail to separate people from politics, we give ourselves permission to hate without reflection. We justify indifference to suffering because we've decided that they deserve it, whoever they are. The faces of war are not always in uniform. They are often tired, frightened, and looking for safety where none exists. These are the people who are first to lose, yet last to be heard. They are not making speeches, issuing threats, or drawing lines in the sand. They are simply waiting for a chance to be seen as something more than collateral in a battle they did not choose. The media tells us what happened, but it rarely tells us why. In a world dominated by breaking news and 30-second sound bites, we are constantly flooded with the what. The explosion, the airstrike, the retaliation, the casualties. These moments are packaged and presented with urgency, often accompanied by dramatic visuals and carefully chosen language. We are told where the missile landed, how many were injured, and what statement followed from which government official. But beyond the surface, beneath the loud headlines, lies the uncomfortable terrain of the why. And that's where the real understanding begins. As consumers of media, we are conditioned to react. We see the images and we feel anger, fear, sadness. But we are rarely invited to pause, to reflect, to ask deeper questions. What led up to this moment? What systems, historical wounds, or ignored negotiations brewed this storm long before it arrived? We are rarely encouraged to explore the roots of the fire, only the blaze itself. But the fire didn't start with the match we just saw. It started with old grievances, power imbalances, silence when dialogue was needed, and decisions made in rooms where no ordinary people were present. Headlines do not tell us about generational trauma. They do not explain the cycles of mistrust passed down like heirlooms. They do not illuminate the years of failed diplomacy, of opportunities missed because pride stood taller than peace. When we only absorb the what, we are left vulnerable to narratives designed to polarize rather than to inform. We become echo chambers, repeating phrases without context, taking sides in arguments we don't fully understand, and turning real suffering into abstract debates. Asking why is uncomfortable but necessary. It requires intellectual humility and emotional courage. It forces us to look at both sides not to justify harm, but to understand how human beings arrive at the brink. It reveals the layers of pain, policy, perception, and power that interlock like gears in a machine designed to repeat itself. And unless we're willing to ask why again and again, even when the answers challenge our world view, we remain trapped in a cycle of reaction without reflection. There is no shortcut to understanding. It demands more than scrolling through news feeds or nodding along to the commentary that aligns with our beliefs. It demands curiosity, the kind that dares to look beyond what is said and toward what is left unsaid. It means asking what stories are being left out, whose voices are not being quoted, what truths are being oversimplified for the sake of digestibility. Because until we learn to ask why, and to sit in the complexity that follows, we will keep mistaking the symptom for the cause, and the violence for the beginning rather than the result. We can't outsource peace. It's one of the hardest truths to accept in a world where we've grown so used to delegating responsibility. We elect leaders, we fund organizations, we follow movements and sign petitions, all in the hope that someone, somewhere, will do the work of healing the world on our behalf. But peace doesn't begin in a chamber of diplomats or behind the closed doors of a negotiation table. It doesn't wait for political speeches or military ceasefires. Peace, in its most lasting form, begins where people live. It begins with the individual choices we make, the conversations we have, the assumptions we challenge, and the humanity we choose to see in one another. When we see countries at war, it's easy to imagine that peace is a concept far beyond us, something grand and diplomatic that only world leaders can bring into being. But the truth is, every act of violence on a global scale is rooted in the same forces we often allow to live in our own hearts: fear, prejudice, pride, the refusal to listen, and the hunger to be right rather than to be kind. If we wait for peace to be handed to us from above, we will wait forever. Because peace isn't a decree, it's a discipline. It's a muscle we build every time we respond with empathy instead of anger, every time we choose understanding over assumption, every time we teach our children not just to be smart, but to be compassionate. Peace is built in the small places. It is shaped at dinner tables where difficult conversations are allowed to happen without shouting. It is nurtured in schools where children are taught the value of another person's life, even when that person doesn't look or pray like they do. It is practiced in the way we treat strangers, especially when we feel afraid or offended. These seemingly insignificant moments create the culture that either allows violence to grow or keeps it in check. Too often, we think of peace as the absence of war, but it's so much more than that. Peace is a mindset, a posture, a commitment to see beyond our own pain and to recognize the pain of others, even those we're told to hate. And while governments may write the treaties, it's people who live the reality. If the people are not invested in peace, no treaty can last. Because true peace requires buy-in at every level, from leaders to laborers, from soldiers to civilians. It must be lived, not just legislated. And that begins with each of us refusing to wait for peace to come and instead choosing to bring it, person by person, heart by heart. The world doesn't need more enemies, it needs more bridge builders in an era where division is loud, fast, and often rewarded. Choosing to be a bridge builder can feel both radical and deeply lonely. We are living in a time when drawing lines seems easier than extending hands, when algorithms feed us fear, when outrage feels more natural than curiosity, and when being right often matters more than being connected. And yet, amidst all this noise, the deepest need of our shared humanity remains unchanged: to be understood, to be safe, and to belong. Bridge builders are not neutral, they are courageous. They do not deny injustice, they do not gloss over pain, but they understand that progress only happens when we find ways to meet in the middle, not to surrender truth, but to recognize shared dignity. They are the ones who sit in the tension, who listen longer, who speak softer not because they are weak, but because they know peace has a different kind of power. They are the people who choose dialogue over demonization, who ask questions before forming judgments, who look into the eyes of the other side, and still manage to see a human being. This world has more than enough people who can point fingers, assign blame, or justify vengeance. What it needs now are people who can sit at the table with difference and not flinch. People who understand that every generation inherits not just history, but the responsibility to shape what comes next. When conflict erupts between nations, the media may portray it as a clash between entire peoples, entire cultures, but the truth is, the vast majority of those people are just trying to live. They don't want war. They don't want to lose their children, their homes, or their futures. They want safety, opportunity, and peace, just like everyone else. Bridge builders step into that space of shared humanity. They carry messages across boundaries, sometimes literally, sometimes emotionally, sometimes spiritually. They absorb tension so others don't have to, and while their work is often unseen, its impact is enormous. They remind us that conflict may be inevitable, but cruelty is not, that disagreement is natural, but dehumanization is a choice, that borders may separate countries, but they don't have to separate hearts. Building bridges is hard, slow, and often thankless work, but it is the only kind of work that prevents the next war before it begins. It's the work of healers, storytellers, mediators, artists, teachers, and everyday people who refuse to let fear be the loudest voice in the room. It is the silent rebellion against hatred, the quiet defiance of division, and the steady, stubborn belief that peace is possible. Not because the world is simple, but because we are willing to do the complicated work of holding it together. In the face of fire and fear, of nations clashing and missiles flying, we must remember that beneath every uniform, beyond every border, and behind every headline, there are people who laugh, cry, pray, and bleed just like us. The events that unfold between Israel and Iran are not just geopolitical, they are deeply human. And in this moment, the world does not need more rage, more retaliation, or more reasons to hate. It needs wisdom. It needs compassion. It needs all of us to rise not with weapons, but with awareness. Peace will not be handed down from podiums or drafted in sterile rooms. It will be built slowly, deliberately, and courageously by those who are willing to hold space for complexity, to challenge their own comfort, and to choose empathy over ego. The work ahead is not easy. It asks us to see the soul behind the stereotype, to speak truth without surrendering grace, and to believe in healing even when the wounds are still fresh. So let the world remember this. Real power is not in how loudly we can strike, but in how deeply we can listen. Real strength is not in how many enemies we create, but in how many bridges we are willing to build. And the real future of our world will be shaped not by those who fuel war, but by those who refuse to forget the value of peace.